Welcome to this review video in preparation for our third exam. Let's jump right into it and go through some of the highlights. Remember, the nervous system could be divided in a few different manners. The structural division included the central nervous system, CNS, which was composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So that is B on the first question. And whatever was not in the brain and the spinal cord in the nervous system was considered as the peripheral nervous system, PNS. That is D on the third question. So good examples include, for example, the spinal nerves and cranial nerves. For the functional division, we saw the sensory branch, which carried messages towards the CNS. So afferent as this information is arriving to the CNS. So that is F on question 2. And we have a motor branch, which is efferent, carrying information away from the CNS to the effectors. So these could be muscles or glands or otherwise. The mnemonic that I provided for that was that it is exiting the CNS. We also had some mixed nerves in this functional classification, that is C for question 5. Finally, on this section, remember the autonomic nervous system, so ANS, was driving the involuntary responses in a motor manner. Think of your heartbeat, for example. It just happens. You don't need to think about having a heartbeat. So that is E option for question 4. Here, next, we are seeing areas of the brain. Remember the lobes. Auditory functions were housed in the temporal lobe. So that is A for question 6. Frontal lobe dealt with executive functions like planning, personality, and so on. And at the back of the frontal lobe, right before we get to the parietal lobe, we saw the primary motor area. This is E on question 7. Motor control of the speech was from Broca's area. This is B for question 8, while the comprehension was from Wernicke's area. Visual processing was instead on the occipital lobe at the very back of the head. And while I have not mentioned it yet, parietal lobe was especially at the primary somatosensory area, all about sensory processing. Then on this next page, we see specific parts within the brain. Remember, the midbrain sat on top of the brain stem. It is composed of specific parts such as cerebral epicondyls and corpora quadrigema. So that is D on question 10. A specific part of the brainstem known as medulla oblongata, or just medulla, is the site where the heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, and vomiting are controlled from. That is B on question 11. We also learned about pituitary gland. That is the master gland that was located underneath the hypothalamus, hanging from there via stalk. We see that as A in question 12. Finally, hypothalamus is often described as the thermostat of the body. It controls your body temperature, but also plays a major role in many other aspects of homeostasis, like fluid balance and metabolism. This is therefore C for question 13. Next, we looked at the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, and parasympathetic nervous system, PNS. Remember, sympathetic nervous system was often captured as our fight or flight system. So it would prepare us to fight against a threat or escape a situation. As such, it would increase our metabolic rate, direct blood to skeletal muscles, stimulate sweat glands to produce more sweat, and increase release of hormones like epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. At the same time, it directs away resources from systems that contribute less to the immediate survival, like digestive and urinary system. It is all about just being ready to protect you in the immediate timeline, not so much about body's maintenance functions. Parasympathetic nervous system was instead what your body would do after you sit down on a lazy boy seat after the Thanksgiving. So all about rest and digest. So it brings down things that we do not need for resting and relaxing, like heart rate, airflow to the lungs, and instead directs these resources to digestive and urinary systems. So here, questions 14 and 17 would go with parasympathetic system. So option A, and the rest would be option B. This next page shows a nice diagram of a generic neuron, so a nerve cell. We see dendrites, which are processes that collect information from around the cell body and carry it to the cell body. So you might remember that I compared them to the antennas of a cell. These would be shown as A on this diagram. Then that information reaches the cell body, shown as D on the image. And this is the metabolic center of a neuron, and also where the information is processed, we see a nucleus here indicated as E. We see an axon as the projection that carries electrical signals away from the cell body, as letter B on this diagram. Remember, they carried messages to only one direction, away from the cell body. Axon ends as an axon terminal. This is indicated with letter C. It is where the neurotransmitters are stored and released from to the synaptic gap. Notice the myelin that wraps around the axon as these blobs, if you wish. This helps to protect and insulate and speed up the messages along the axon. Myelin was produced by Schwann cells. Notice the gaps between these blobs of myelin. These are shown as H. These were important because as the message passed down the myelinated axon, the message jumped from one gap to another. Here on the next page, we have various statements about the entire nervous system. So let's tackle that. So the question 27, it states that spinal nerves and cranial nerves are part of what part of the nervous system? And it would be, of course, peripheral part. Remember, it is outside the brain and spinal cord. Question 28 asks about those cells that form myelin around axon, and in the peripheral nervous system, they were known as Schwann cells. Question 29. Remember that we had glial cells, which are also known as neuroglia. These were supporting cells in the nervous system, supporting neurons both physically and physiologically. Question 30 asks about specific type of glial cells known as astrocytes. Remember, these were star-shaped cells within the central nervous system. 31. The gaps between these myelin-producing Schwann cells within the peripheral nervous system were known as nodes of Ranvier. Question 32. Sensory receptors located in muscles and tendons were called proprioceptors. These are specialized mechanoceptors which provide constant feedback to the central nervous system about muscle or tendon length, tension, or joint position. Question 33 shows us that while we studied the general model of a neuron earlier, there is actually a lot more variation. Those with two processes, axon and dendrite, are known as bipolar neurons. The cell body is in between these two. Then question 34. we saw that the ability of a neuron to respond to a stimulus and convert it into a nerve impulse is known as irritability. Question 35. Remember that we had autonomic reflexes. Some examples of these are secretion of saliva, changes in the pupil size, and adjustments in the digestion, all thanks to unconscious actions of smooth muscles. Question 36 reminds us about a region called diencephalon. It is made of thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Then a more clinical question as number 37. The condition known as cerebrovascular accident, CVA, was when the blood supply to a part of the brain is blocked and the brain tissue starts consequently die. And this was caused by blood clot or ruptured vessel. Question 38, remember that we protected the brain on many levels. We had the skeletal protection of the cranium and connective tissue layers known as meninges, as well as the blood-brain barrier adaptation. We also remember that the brain was bathed in the cerebrospinal fluid, and that traveled both inside the brain as well as inside the spinal cord's gray matter within the central canal of the spinal cord. Now, question 40, remember the frontal lobe, and within it had the primary motor area, which is where the conscious control of skeletal muscles originated from. Question 41, the two cerebral hemispheres, so the big parts of the brain, were separated by longitudinal fissure. It divided those into right and left side. And then, as seen in question 42, we had a pituitary gland hanging right underneath the hypothalamus. Remember, this was the master gland as it regulated all other endocrine glands. Question 43 reminds us that about that white band of myelinated axons forming a fiber tract and how they connected the two cerebral hemispheres. This structure was called as corpus callosum. Question 44 highlights us that the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, was formed by the choroid plexuses. To the next page, question 45. There were 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Remember, these were labeled with the Roman numerals, and there were 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Both of these are peripheral nervous system structures. Question 46. A condition known as Parkinson's disease resulted from the degeneration of these specific neurons. Then remember that we had cranial nerve known as vagus nerve. It translated from Latin as the wandering kind, which well captures the fact that it extends to many parts of the body, including thoracic and abdominal cavities. Question 48, the parasympathetic branch of ANS was known as the rest and digest system, while sympathetic was the fight or flight one, as we earlier discussed. Question 49 shows us the cranial nerve tree, which was our oculomotor nerve. Next, we have another matching activity looking in more detail special senses and especially the vision. Question 50 asks us about the whites of the eyes, which are known as the sclera, indicated by letter H here. The tear glands asked in question 51 are our lacrimal glands. Question 52 asks about the photoreceptor type that detects colors, and these were our cones. Remember, rods worked better in dark, but with less color information. Question 53 asks about the lens, which is flexible by convex structure at the front of an eye. 54, cornea was the transparent portion of the fibrous layer. 55, it is vitreous humor that we see at the posterior segment. 56 refers us to retina, which contain those photoreceptors at the back of the eyeball, which we just talked about. 57, area of the greatest visual acuity is the fovea centralis. 58, the blind spot was formed by optic disc, where the optic nerve left the eye. Now, on the next page, we will continue discussing special senses. This is for hearing and balance. Ceremonous glands produce earwax, as seen as N in the question 59. Tympanic membrane was the eardrum, indicated by letter I on question 60. Auditory tube in question 61 linked the middle ear to the throat, so letter E for 61. 62, malleus was the hammer, one of the three tiny bones of the ear. Question 63, division of the cranial nerve 8 that transmitted sounds to the brain was cochlear nerve. This is A in this question. Question 64 asks us about cochlea. This was the subdivision that looked a little bit like the shell of a snail. So B for this question. Question 65, semicircular canals contained receptors for the sense of balance. This is indicated by letter B. We continue with matching for sense of taste. Sweet receptors, indicated by letter D, match with the question 66, so sugar and saccharine. Sour receptors, so letter A for the question 67, so oranges and tomatoes. Question 68, this is going to be B, so bitter receptors for alkaloids. And finally, salt receptors, so C for metal ions in solution in the question 69. Two more pages. On this page, we look at the vision again. Question 70 asks about nearsightedness, which is known as myopia. This is indicated by letter C. Question 71 indicated increased pressure within the eye is glaucoma, so letter D. For 72, the blurry images due to unequal curvatures of the cornea or lens were astigmatism, so letter E. We had those charts in the classroom for you to use and check your own vision. Question 73, when the eyeball was too short, we talk about hyperopia. This is letter F. Question 74, inflammation of the conjunctiva was known as conjunctivitis. This is letter G. And finally, question 75, prolonged vitamin A shortage can result in deterioration of the natural retina, and this is known as night blindness, indicated by H. Next, we have a nice diagram of the ear structures. Here we see auricle, so the outer ear, as letter F, and the tympanic membrane as letter I. Referring to the same diagram, question 78 asks us to identify semicircular channels, which are seen as C. Note how they give us the different planes. And question 79, cochlea is shown as letter B, so that snail-looking like structure. 80, we are asked to label the auditory tube, which was indicated by letter A. Question 81, the hammer is shown with letter E. And finally, the stirrup, last of our small bones, is shown with letter H. Now, let's finish off this set of questions. Question 83. The membrane that covers the outer surface of the eye and lines the eyelids is the conjunctiva. Question 84. The 6 muscles that create the eye movements are the extrinsic muscles. 85, the lens divided the eye into anterior and posterior segments. Question 86, the image that falls to the retina was known as the real image. Remember, it was upside down. Question 87, we had optic chiasm, where the fibers crossed to the other side. 88, the chemoreceptors for the smell were known as olfactory ones. And final question, the 5 taste sensations were sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. This brings us to the end of this review sheet. Thank you for joining me for this.